Welcome to Mystery Stories, a quiet place where simple moments hide deeper secrets. In peaceful villages and familiar homes, small details often reveal truths no one expected. Tonight's story follows a curious watch that stopped at 4, and the gentle mind that noticed something was not quite right. Settle in, relax, and let this mystery unfold slowly, one careful observation at a time. Chapter 1. People in St. Aldwyn had a habit of noticing small things before breakfast. It was a village where the baker knew who had visitors, where the postman quietly observed who received letters with foreign stamps, and where the gardener of Rosebank House was known to whistle loudly while trimming the roses each morning. That was why it felt particularly strange when the whistling suddenly stopped. The morning had begun gently, with pale sunlight sliding over the stone cottages and a thin layer of mist resting over the hedgerows. Thomas Bell, the gardener at Rosebank House, had arrived as he always did, pushing open the small side gate and carrying his pruning shears in one hand. He had paused a moment, as he often did, admiring the rose beds that lined the gravel path. Mr. Gerald Wainwright had taken great pride in those roses. He had once told Thomas that roses were like people. If treated carefully and given patience, they rewarded you with beauty. If neglected, they became troublesome very quickly. Thomas had bent down to inspect a pale pink bloom when something unusual caught his eye. At first, he thought someone had dropped a coat along the gravel path near the rose beds. The figure lay still, half turned toward the garden wall. Thomas stood up slowly, his shears dangling loosely in his hand. "Mr. Wainwright?" he called. The figure did not move. A small uneasiness crept over him then. Thomas approached cautiously, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. As he stepped closer, the shape resolved itself clearly into the body of Gerald Wainwright. The gentleman lay on his side beside the rose bushes, his gray coat slightly dusted with gravel. His hat had fallen several feet away and rested near the edge of the flower bed. One arm lay awkwardly beneath him, while the other hand rested upon his chest. In that hand he was holding something. Thomas crouched slowly, his brow furrowing. It was a gold pocket watch. The glass covering the face had cracked cleanly across the center. The watch hands pointed precisely to 4 o'clock. Thomas Bell stared at it for several seconds before finally whispering to himself, "Now that's a strange place for a watch." He touched Mr. Wainwright's shoulder gently. The body did not respond. The stillness was unmistakable. Within 20 minutes, St. Aldwyn had begun to murmur. Villages possess a remarkable ability to share news without appearing to do so. By the time the vicar finished his morning letters, the baker had already heard. By the time the baker told his assistant, Mrs. Harcourt had passed the news to 2 customers purchasing scones. Before long, the quiet statement began circulating in various forms. Poor Mr. Wainwright. Found in the garden. Collapsed, apparently. Heart trouble, most likely. By mid-morning, Rosebank House had become the quiet center of attention. The house itself stood comfortably on the edge of the village, its brick walls softened by climbing ivy, and its garden neatly arranged in long rows of flowers and hedges. It was the sort of place that looked peaceful from a distance. Inside, however, the atmosphere had grown strained. Dr. Lambert had arrived shortly after Thomas Bell's discovery. He examined the body beside the rose beds and spoke in low, careful tones. Mr. Wainwright had not been a young man, and there had been occasional mentions of fatigue in recent months. It was entirely possible that he had stepped outside for fresh air and collapsed suddenly. Still, the doctor had glanced once or twice at the pocket watch resting beside the body. The cracked glass seemed oddly deliberate, but such thoughts were easily dismissed on a quiet spring morning. Not far from Rosebank House, Miss Marple was sitting near a small window in the cottage of her old friend, Mrs. Edith Linton. The 2 women had been enjoying a peaceful visit for several days. A pot of tea rested comfortably between them, and a plate of biscuits sat untouched as they spoke about small village matters. Mrs. Linton was midway through explaining the peculiar habits of the new greengrocer when a distant knock sounded at the door. The maid opened it, and a hurried whisper passed through the hallway. Mrs. Linton's eyebrows lifted. "My goodness," she said quietly. "That sounds like Rosebank House." Miss Marple looked up gently. "Rosebank?" she repeated. Mrs. Linton leaned closer, lowering her voice though there was no one near enough to overhear. "Mr. Gerald Wainwright," she said. "Apparently he was found in the garden this morning. Quite suddenly." Miss Marple's expression softened with polite concern. "How unfortunate," she said. "Yes, terribly unfortunate," Mrs. Linton agreed, "though I must say he always appeared quite strong to me." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully and poured another small cup of tea. In villages, she had often noticed, the first explanation offered was rarely the most interesting one. Later that afternoon, Rosebank House received several visitors. These were not visitors in the dramatic sense. St. Aldwyn was far too polite for that. Rather, they were the sort of people who arrived gently with quiet sympathy and mild curiosity. A casserole appeared from one neighbor. Another arrived with a basket of fruit. Each visitor spoke softly and left after a respectful amount of time. Miss Marple accompanied Mrs. Linton during one of these visits. The drawing room at Rosebank House had been arranged for afternoon tea. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows and rested upon polished furniture and carefully arranged flowers. Yet the pleasant appearance of the room did little to disguise the tension sitting quietly among the guests. Mr. Wainwright's niece, Miss Clara Wainwright, stood near the tea table. She was a pale young woman with composed manners, though today her composure appeared fragile. "Thank you for coming," she said politely as the guests arrived. Miss Marple took a seat beside the window and observed the room with gentle interest. Several familiar faces had gathered. Mrs. Harcourt sat near the fireplace, already whispering quietly with the vicar's wife. Mr. Lionel Pierce, Mr. Wainwright's business partner, stood near the mantelpiece, holding a cup he had not yet tasted. Conversation moved cautiously, as if everyone were afraid to disturb the fragile quietness of the afternoon. "It must have happened very quickly," Mrs. Harcourt murmured. "Yes," said the vicar's wife softly. "Dr. Lambert believes it was quite sudden." Miss Clara nodded. "My uncle had been resting indoors most of the afternoon," she said. "Reading letters, I believe." Miss Marple lifted her eyes slightly at that remark. Across the room, someone mentioned the pocket watch. "Oh yes," Mrs. Harcourt said with interest. "They said it stopped at 4 o'clock." Mr. Pierce shifted slightly where he stood. "Quite an unfortunate detail," he said, attempting a mild smile. Miss Marple noticed the small movement. She also noticed that Clara Wainwright's fingers tightened slightly around the teapot. "That must have been the moment," Mrs. Harcourt continued gently. "Poor man." Miss Marple spoke then, her tone warm and casual. "Was he fond of that watch?" she asked. Clara looked up. "Oh yes," she said quickly. "He always carried it." Miss Marple nodded and stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Curious," she said softly. No one asked why. Outside the tall windows, the rose garden rested quietly beneath the afternoon sun. The gravel path where Mr. Wainwright had been found looked entirely peaceful now. Inside the drawing room, however, small changes began to ripple beneath the calm surface of conversation. Mr. Pierce spoke very little after the watch was mentioned. Clara Wainwright, on the other hand, spoke perhaps a little too quickly. "My uncle was indoors at 4, she said once more, almost as if reassuring herself. Miss Marple listened. The watch said 4. The niece said indoors. Somewhere in that small contradiction rested the faintest whisper of unease. Miss Marple sipped her tea quietly and allowed the room to continue speaking around her. People often revealed far more than they intended during such moments. A glance here. A careful choice of words there. By the time the afternoon tea ended, Miss Marple had spoken very little. Yet she had noticed several things. The nervous way Mr. Pierce avoided mentioning the garden. The firmness with which Clara insisted upon the time. And above all, the curious silence that settled over the room whenever the broken watch was discussed. As Miss Marple rose to leave with Mrs. Linton, she paused briefly beside the window. The rose beds glowed gently beneath the fading sunlight. Somewhere beyond them lay the gravel path where a man had fallen with a watch clasped carefully in his hand. Miss Marple's eyes rested on the garden for a long moment. Then she smiled her small, thoughtful smile. Because watches, she had often observed, were wonderfully reliable objects. They told the truth with remarkable consistency, which made it all the more interesting when one appeared to be telling a story that someone seemed eager to believe. And Miss Marple, smiling kindly as she stepped out into the quiet village evening, knew she had just seen the first shadow of something far more complicated than a simple accident. Chapter 2. There was something about village tea rooms that made truth wander very close to the surface. Perhaps it was the quiet comfort of warm cups and familiar chairs. Perhaps it was the feeling that ordinary conversation could safely drift into more interesting territory. Whatever the reason, the tea room in St. Aldwyn had always been a place where information moved gently but steadily from one table to another. The morning after Mr. Gerald Wainwright was found in the garden of Rosebank House, the tea room was particularly lively. Outside, the village square looked much the same as it always had. The grocer arranged his vegetables carefully beneath a striped awning. The postman moved along the lane with his steady pace. Sparrows hopped along the low stone wall near the bakery. But inside the tea room, the atmosphere hummed quietly with curiosity. Miss Marple arrived just before 11. She stepped inside with the calm air of someone who expected nothing unusual from the morning, though anyone who knew her well might have noticed the thoughtful look behind her gentle smile. Mrs. Finch, the owner of the tea room, greeted her warmly. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Your usual table by the window?" "That would be lovely," Miss Marple replied. She settled comfortably into the small chair beside the window and folded her gloves neatly beside her teacup. From that position, she could observe the entire room without appearing to do so. It did not take long for the conversation to begin drifting in a particular direction. At the next table sat Mrs. Harcourt, whose interest in village events was widely known. She leaned toward the vicar's wife and spoke in a careful whisper that was not particularly quiet. "Such a shock," Mrs. Harcourt murmured. "I never imagined anything like it." The vicar's wife nodded solemnly. "Very sudden, they say." Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. Mrs. Harcourt lowered her voice slightly further. "Though I must say," she continued, "I did see Mr. Wainwright yesterday afternoon." The vicar's wife leaned closer. "Did you indeed?" "Yes, walking along the church path. It must have been just before 4. Miss Marple's spoon paused softly against the side of the cup. "The church path. Before 4. Mrs. Harcourt continued with quiet certainty. "He seemed perfectly well. I remember thinking he walked rather briskly for a man his age." "That is curious," said the vicar's wife thoughtfully. Miss Marple allowed her gaze to drift toward the window, though she continued listening with quiet attention, because the previous afternoon, Clara Wainwright had spoken quite confidently. "My uncle was indoors at 4, reading letters." Miss Marple sipped her tea slowly. It was remarkable how often two entirely reasonable statements refused to sit comfortably beside one another. At that moment, Mrs. Finch arrived with a fresh pot of tea. "Busy morning," she said cheerfully. "Everyone seems to be talking about Rosebank House." Mrs. Harcourt nodded eagerly. "Well, naturally. One doesn't expect such things in a quiet place like St. Aldwyn." Miss Marple smiled politely. "Quite so," she said. The conversation drifted briefly toward other subjects before gently circling back again. "Poor Mr. Pierce," Mrs. Harcourt said after a moment. Miss Marple glanced up slightly. "Mr. Pierce?" she asked mildly. "Yes, Lionel Pierce," Mrs. Harcourt replied. "Mr. Wainwright's business partner. They worked together for years." Miss Marple nodded. "I noticed he was present yesterday afternoon." "Oh, yes," said Mrs. Harcourt. "He looked terribly worried." The vicar's wife added thoughtfully, I believe they had been discussing business matters recently. Mrs. Harcourt lowered her voice once again. Someone mentioned that Mr. Wainwright had recently changed his will. The vicar's wife blinked. Changed his will? That's what I heard. Miss Marple raised her eyebrows very slightly. Village rumors often arrived before the truth had even finished putting on its coat. Still, such remarks were rarely invented entirely without cause. Miss Marple placed her teacup down carefully. Wills can be such complicated matters, she said gently. Mrs. Harcourt nodded. Indeed they can. Across the room, two gentlemen near the window had begun discussing another small detail. Miss Marple caught a few fragments drifting through the air. That watch. Stopped exactly at 4. Glass cracked clean through. Miss Marple listened quietly. The watch again. It was curious how often the conversation returned to that single object. After finishing her tea, Miss Marple rose and walked slowly toward the counter to settle her bill. Mrs. Finch leaned forward slightly. Strange business, she said. Yes, Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. Mrs. Finch lowered her voice. I heard the watch had only just been repaired last week. Miss Marple paused. Repaired? Yes. At the shop in Broadford. Mr. Wainwright took it there himself. Miss Marple's eyes brightened with quiet interest. A very reliable shop, I imagine. Oh, yes, Mrs. Finch said confidently. Mr. Calder runs it. He's been repairing watches for 30 years. Miss Marple thanked her politely and stepped outside into the village square. The morning sunlight had grown warmer now, and a light breeze moved through the branches of the trees lining the road. Miss Marple stood still for a moment. A watch that had recently been repaired. A watch that had stopped precisely at 4. Miss Marple had always believed that mechanical objects possessed a kind of honesty. They rarely behaved mysteriously without assistance. She began walking slowly along the road toward Broadford. It was a pleasant walk of nearly half an hour through quiet countryside lanes. Hedges bordered the narrow road, and birds moved lazily through the warm spring air. Miss Marple enjoyed such walks. They allowed the mind to arrange thoughts with gentle patience. By the time she reached the small watchmaker's shop, the village bells were ringing softly in the distance. The shop itself was narrow, but tidy. Inside, rows of clocks ticked softly along the walls, each marking time with quiet determination. Behind the counter stood Mr. Calder, a thin man with careful hands and sharp spectacles. Good morning, he said. Miss Marple smiled warmly. Good morning. I hope you will forgive a small question. Mr. Calder nodded. Of course. Miss Marple glanced briefly at the clocks lining the walls. I understand Mr. Gerald Wainwright recently brought his watch here for repair. Mr. Calder's expression shifted slightly. Yes, a gold pocket watch. I wondered how it was running after the repair, Mr. Calder answered immediately. Perfectly. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. Perfectly? Yes, he said firmly. Fine mechanism. I cleaned the movement and replaced the spring. It left here in excellent condition. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. I see. Mr. Calder studied her for a moment. I heard what happened, he added quietly. Yes, Miss Marple said gently. Mr. Calder folded his hands. A watch like that doesn't simply stop without reason. Miss Marple allowed a small silence to settle between them. Unless something caused it to stop, she said softly. Mr. Calder nodded once. Yes. Miss Marple thanked him politely and stepped outside again. The village road stretched ahead beneath the clear afternoon sky. Somewhere in the distance, a cart rattled slowly along the lane. Miss Marple began her walk back toward St. Aldwyn, her pace slow and thoughtful. A watch recently repaired, running perfectly, yet found cracked and stopped precisely at 4. Such a neat little detail. Too neat, perhaps. As she reached the edge of the village, she noticed 2 figures walking near the church path. One of them was Mrs. Harcourt. The other was Mr. Lionel Pierce. They appeared to be speaking quietly. As Miss Marple approached, their conversation stopped rather abruptly. Mr. Pierce removed his hat politely. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple." "Good afternoon," she replied warmly. "Mrs." Harcourt smiled with mild embarrassment. "We were just discussing the unfortunate business at Rosebank House." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Yes, it has caused quite a stir." Mr. Pierce adjusted his collar slightly. "Very unfortunate indeed." Miss Marple watched him for a moment. There was a faint tension in his voice. Not grief exactly. Something closer to worry. Miss Marple smiled kindly and continued along the path. Behind her, the two figures resumed their conversation in lower tones. Miss Marple walked slowly through the quiet village street. A small breeze rustled the hedges. Children's laughter drifted faintly from somewhere near the school. Everything appeared entirely ordinary. Yet the small pieces of information she had gathered that morning rested together in a rather uncomfortable arrangement. A watch that should not have stopped. A time that did not match the stories. And several villagers who seemed oddly careful when speaking about the moment of 4 o'clock. Miss Marple reached the gate of Mrs. Linton's cottage and paused before entering. The village clock chimed softly in the distance. 4 clear notes. Miss Marple looked toward the sound with thoughtful eyes, because the more she considered it, the more that particular hour seemed to carry an unusual importance. And Miss Marple, folding her gloves carefully in her hands, began to wonder why such a reliable watch would suddenly choose, that very moment, to stop. Chapter 3. Money, in a village like St. Aldwyn, was rarely discussed openly. It existed in quiet hints and careful remarks. People spoke of difficult times, or of someone managing rather tightly, but the exact numbers and worries usually remained behind closed doors. Yet every now and then, a small clue would appear. An unpaid bill, a delayed repair, a slightly strained tone when a subject was mentioned. And to someone with Miss Marple's gentle patience, such small clues were often far more revealing than dramatic events. The morning after her visit to the watchmaker, Miss Marple set out for a quiet walk through the village lanes. It was one of those pleasant spring mornings that made St. Aldwyn appear particularly peaceful. The hedges were bright with new leaves, and the air carried the soft scent of damp earth and early flowers. Villages often revealed their secrets most easily during such ordinary moments. Miss Marple walked slowly, her hands folded loosely around the handle of her small handbag. She greeted a few villagers as she passed them, exchanging pleasant remarks about the weather and the roses beginning to bloom near the churchyard. Yet behind her calm manner, her thoughts were carefully arranging themselves. A watch that had stopped at 4. A niece who insisted her uncle had been indoors at that hour. A villager who claimed she had seen him walking outside shortly before that same time. And a watchmaker who had confidently stated that the watch had been working perfectly only days before. Miss Marple had long believed that when two simple facts refused to agree, one must quietly ask which of them had been encouraged to bend. Her walk eventually led her toward a modest brick house at the edge of the village green. The house belonged to Mr. Lionel Pierce. Mr. Pierce had been Gerald Wainwright's business partner for many years. In a place like St. Aldwyn, such partnerships often lasted longer than friendships. The two men had operated a small but respectable trading firm together, managing shipments of grain and supplies between neighboring towns. Miss Marple paused at the small garden gate and looked thoughtfully toward the house. The curtains in the front window were open. A figure moved faintly inside. Miss Marple gently lifted the latch and walked up the short path. Moments later, the door opened. Mr. Pierce stood there, looking slightly surprised. "Miss Marple," he said politely. "Good morning." "Good morning, Mr. Pierce," she replied warmly. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "No, no," he said quickly. "Please do come in." The interior of the house was tidy, though not particularly cheerful. A narrow hallway led toward a small sitting room where a writing desk stood near the window. Mr. Pierce gestured toward a chair. "Please sit." Miss Marple settled comfortably and placed her handbag on her lap. "I hope you will forgive a small visit," she said gently. "I have been thinking about poor Mr. Wainwright, and I realized how little I knew about his business life." Mr. Pierce nodded slowly. "Yes, a great loss." Miss Marple watched him quietly as he spoke. There was something slightly strained in his manner. His movements were careful, as if he were choosing each word before allowing it to leave his mouth. "You and Mr. Wainwright worked together many years, I believe," Miss Marple said. "Nearly 15, Mr. Pierce replied. "That is quite a long partnership." "Yes." Miss Marple glanced briefly toward the writing desk near the window. Several papers rested upon its surface, though one stack appeared to have been pushed aside rather hurriedly. "I imagine such a partnership requires a great deal of trust," she said. Mr. Pierce nodded. "Indeed." Miss Marple's voice remained warm and conversational. "And the business was doing well?" There was a small pause before he answered. "Well enough." Miss Marple noticed that slight hesitation. Her eyes drifted toward the desk again. Among the scattered papers, she could see several envelopes stamped with red ink. Unpaid notices were remarkably easy to recognize. Mr. Pierce seemed to notice her glance. "Oh, just routine accounts," he said quickly. Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Of course." She allowed the silence to stretch just long enough to feel natural. Then she spoke again. "I understand you visited Rosebank House on the afternoon Mr. Wainwright passed away." "Yes," Mr. Pierce said. His tone had grown a little tighter. "We discussed some business matters." "And you left early?" "Yes, around 3 o'clock." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Such a sad thing," she murmured. "To leave a man one moment and hear of his passing the next." "Yes," Mr. Pierce agreed. But his voice sounded slightly distant. Miss Marple studied him quietly. It was not grief she sensed. It was something else, something closer to unease. She rose gently from her chair. "Well, thank you for indulging my curiosity," she said kindly. "I hope the coming weeks will not be too difficult for you." Mr. Pierce walked her to the door. "Thank you, Miss Marple." Outside, the warm sunlight seemed almost startling after the tense quiet of the house. Miss Marple walked slowly back toward the village. A cart passed along the lane, its wheels crunching softly over the gravel road. Miss Marple paused beside the hedge near the church path. The conversation with Mr. Pierce had been quite ordinary on the surface. Yet several small details had remained behind in her mind. The hurried stack of unpaid bills, the quickness with which he answered certain questions, and above all, the careful precision of his statement. "I left around 3. Miss Marple repeated that phrase quietly to herself as she continued walking. Around 3. Such an interesting choice of words. Not exactly 3. Not precisely 3:15. Simply around. By the time she reached the village square, the afternoon had begun settling comfortably over St. Aldwyn. The baker's window displayed fresh loaves, and several villagers stood chatting outside the grocer's shop. Miss Marple paused near the post box, where she encountered Dr. Lambert. The doctor greeted her warmly. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple." "Good afternoon, doctor." They walked together for a short distance along the shaded lane. "Very unfortunate business at Rosebank House," Miss Marple said gently. Dr. Lambert nodded. "Yes, indeed." Miss Marple glanced at him thoughtfully. "Mr. Wainwright had been in delicate health, I believe?" The doctor frowned slightly. "Not particularly." Miss Marple looked mildly surprised. "Oh?" "He was a remarkably strong man for his age," the doctor said. "A bit stubborn, perhaps, but quite healthy." Miss Marple slowed her pace slightly. "So the fall must have been quite sudden." "Yes." Dr. Lambert adjusted his hat. "I would not have expected such a collapse from him." Miss Marple thanked him politely and continued on her way. But her thoughts had grown considerably more serious. If Mr. Wainwright had not been suffering from serious illness, then the explanation offered by the village seemed far less comfortable. Miss Marple turned onto a narrow lane leading toward Rosebank House. The afternoon sun rested warmly over the garden walls and the rose beds looked peaceful beneath the clear sky. It was difficult to imagine that only a day earlier a man had been found lying beside those flowers. Miss Marple stood quietly near the gate for a moment. The gravel path stretched gently toward the house. Somewhere along that path, the watch had been found. Stopped precisely at 4. Miss Marple's eyes moved thoughtfully across the garden. A strong man, a watch that had been working perfectly, and a business partner who appeared to be experiencing financial difficulty. Miss Marple folded her hands together. She had often noticed that money possessed a curious ability to make sensible people behave rather strangely. As she turned to leave, a faint memory drifted back to her. Mrs. Harcourt's voice in the tea room. I saw him walking along the church path, just before 4. Miss Marple looked once more toward the quiet garden of Rosebank House. Because if that statement were true, then someone had not been entirely honest about what had happened that afternoon. And Miss Marple, walking slowly back along the lane beneath the quiet spring sunlight, began to wonder whether financial desperation might persuade a respectable man to take a very dangerous chance. Chapter 4. In villages like St. Aldwyn, the sorting of a person's belongings after their passing was considered both a duty and a delicate social ritual. Neighbors arrived with quiet sympathy, drawers were opened with careful hands, and every letter or photograph was treated with the gentle respect of memory. Yet now and then, during such peaceful tasks, something unexpected had a way of appearing. It was a soft, gray morning when Miss Marple walked once again toward Rosebank House. A thin mist hung lightly over the hedges, and the gravel road was still damp from the night's cool air. The village had settled back into its ordinary rhythm, though the subject of Mr. Gerald Wainwright still floated quietly through conversations like a leaf on slow water. Miss Marple reached the gate and paused briefly, looking toward the house. The roses beside the gravel path had begun to open more fully in the warmer weather. Their soft colors made it difficult to imagine that the same quiet garden had been the scene of such a troubling discovery only 2 days earlier. Clara Wainwright greeted Miss Marple warmly at the door. "I'm so glad you came," she said, though her smile appeared tired. "You mentioned you were sorting through your uncle's papers," Miss Marple said kindly. "Yes," Clara replied. "There are rather more than I expected." They walked together into the study. The room carried the comfortable atmosphere of a place that had been used regularly for many years. Shelves of books lined the walls, and a large writing desk stood near the window overlooking the garden. Several neat stacks of papers had already been arranged on the desk. Clara sighed softly as she sat down. "My uncle kept everything," she said. "Every receipt, every letter." Miss Marple took a seat nearby and folded her hands gently in her lap. "That is often the way with careful men," she said. Clara began opening one drawer after another, sorting envelopes into tidy piles. Occasionally, she paused to read a line or two before placing the paper aside. For a while, the room remained peaceful, except for the quiet rustle of paper. Then, Miss Marple noticed something. One of the desk drawers did not open. Clara pulled at it once or twice before frowning slightly. "That's odd," she murmured. "Locked?" Miss Marple suggested. "Yes." Clara looked puzzled. "I don't remember my uncle locking his desk." Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair and stepped closer. The drawer was indeed locked. Clara searched briefly among the papers before discovering a small brass key tucked inside an envelope. "That must be it," she said. She inserted the key and turned it gently. The drawer opened with a soft click. Inside rested several documents and a small bundle of letters tied together with string. On top of them lay a folded sheet of paper written in Gerald Wainwright's firm, careful handwriting. Clara unfolded it slowly. Her eyes moved across the page. After a moment, her expression changed. Miss Marple noticed the slight tightening around her mouth. "Is something the matter?" she asked gently. Clara hesitated before answering. "It appears to be a letter to his solicitor." Miss Marple waited quietly. Clara read a few lines aloud, her voice growing softer. "I have recently discovered certain matters which require immediate correction. I intend to visit you tomorrow morning to discuss what must be done. A very serious mistake has been allowed to continue for far too long. Clara lowered the letters slowly. How strange, she murmured. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. Indeed. Clara read the final lines again. There is no mention of what he meant, she said. Miss Marple looked thoughtfully toward the garden outside the window. I imagine he intended to explain it during his visit, she said gently. Clara folded the letter carefully and placed it back on the desk. I suppose it must have been something related to business. Miss Marple nodded politely, though she noticed that Clara's eyes lingered on the open drawer for a moment longer than necessary. Clara then began searching through the remaining items inside. After a few seconds, she frowned again. That's curious. What is it? Miss Marple asked. My uncle always kept his watch chain in this drawer when he wasn't wearing it. Miss Marple glanced toward the drawer. And it is not there? No. Clara searched the drawer once more before shaking her head. It's missing. Miss Marple said nothing, but she remembered the watch that had been found in Gerald Wainwright's hand beside the rose beds. It had indeed been attached to a chain. A rather sturdy chain, if memory served. Clara closed the drawer slowly. I suppose he must have been wearing it that afternoon, she said. Miss Marple smiled gently. Yes, that would seem likely. At that moment, a faint sound drifted in from the garden. Miss Marple turned slightly toward the open window. It was the voice of the housemaid speaking somewhere outside. Heard them quite clearly. Miss Marple rose quietly and stepped closer to the window. The maid stood near the rose beds speaking with Thomas Bell, the gardener. Voices in the garden, the maid was saying. Quite sharp voices, too. Thomas frowned. When was that? Just before 4, I believe. Miss Marple's eyes rested thoughtfully on the gravel path. Voices in the garden. Just before 4. Miss Marple returned to her chair. Clara had not heard the conversation outside, but Miss Marple's thoughts had already begun arranging the new piece of information beside the others. A watch stopped at 4. A niece certain her uncle had been indoors at that time. A villager who had seen him walking before 4, and now raised voices in the garden shortly before that same hour. Clara spoke again, drawing Miss Marple's attention back to the desk. There are still so many papers to examine, she said with a tired smile. Miss Marple nodded kindly. Yes, these things do take time. Clara stood and gathered several documents into a neat stack. My uncle was always very organized, she added. He disliked unfinished business. Miss Marple allowed her eyes to move slowly across the study. Organized. Careful. A man who wrote letters to his solicitor when something required correction. Miss Marple stood and walked toward the window again. The rose garden lay peacefully beneath the pale sky. But Miss Marple's thoughts were no longer peaceful, because the letter suggested something quite important. Gerald Wainwright had discovered a serious mistake. He had planned to correct it the very next morning, yet he had never reached that morning. Miss Marple turned back toward Clara. You mentioned your uncle had been reading letters that afternoon, she said gently. Yes, Clara replied. Miss Marple nodded slowly. How interesting. Clara looked puzzled. Interesting? Yes. Miss Marple smiled kindly and reached for her gloves, because a man who intended to visit his solicitor the next morning to correct a serious mistake would very likely have spent part of his afternoon preparing for that visit, reviewing documents, examining accounts, possibly even confronting someone involved. Miss Marple stepped toward the door. Outside, the garden looked calm and quiet once again. Yet the small pieces of information she had gathered that morning had begun to form a rather unsettling picture. A missing watch chain. A hidden letter. Raised voices near the rose beds shortly before 4. Miss Marple paused briefly at the doorway and glanced once more toward the desk drawer. Someone had locked that drawer. Someone had carefully hidden that letter, and someone had clearly been very interested in what Gerald Wainwright had discovered. Miss Marple stepped out into the cool morning air and closed the door softly behind her, because she had begun to suspect something quite important. The watch that stopped at 4 might not have been the only object that afternoon carefully arranged to tell a story. And Miss Marple, walking slowly along the garden path with her quiet, thoughtful smile, was beginning to wonder who had taken such care to arrange it. Chapter 5. In a village like St. Aldwyn, walking was often the best way to think. The lanes were quiet, the hedges familiar, and the slow rhythm of footsteps seemed to allow thoughts to settle into place one by one. Miss Marple had always found that a mystery often began to reveal itself not in crowded drawing rooms, but along peaceful paths where the mind could move freely. It was late afternoon when she turned toward the narrow track that ran beside the churchyard. The sky carried that soft golden color that arrived just before evening, and the small stone church stood calmly against the light like an old friend watching over the village. Mrs. Harcourt had mentioned this very path only the day before. I saw him walking along the church path, just before 4. Miss Marple walked slowly along the gravel, her eyes moving thoughtfully from one small detail to another. The hedges beside the path were tall and thick, and through the gaps she could see the back gardens of several cottages. A breeze rustled gently through the leaves, carrying the faint scent of roses from somewhere nearby. She reached the point where the church path curved toward the lane leading to Rosebank House. If Gerald Wainwright had walked this way that afternoon, he would have reached his own garden gate within a few minutes. Miss Marple paused and looked carefully toward the direction of the house. The distance was not great. From the church path to the rose beds where he had been found would take no more than a short walk. Her eyes rested thoughtfully on the gravel beneath her shoes, because one detail continued to trouble her: the watch. Thomas Bell had said the watch was found in Mr. Wainwright's hand. Not beside him, not several feet away as might happen in a fall. Carefully, in his hand. Miss Marple turned slowly and began walking toward Rosebank House. The late afternoon light lay gently over the hedges as she reached the small side gate. The garden was quiet, and the rose beds stretched neatly along the path, just as they had the morning the gardener made his discovery. Miss Marple stepped inside. She walked along the gravel slowly, her eyes scanning the ground with quiet attention. The stone bench stood near the center of the garden. Its surface was worn smooth by years of weather. A few fallen rose petals rested on the gravel nearby. Miss Marple stopped beside the bench and looked down. She imagined the scene carefully. A man walking along the path, perhaps pausing beside the roses, perhaps speaking with someone. If he had suddenly collapsed, Miss Marple took a small step back and studied the position where his body had been found. Something did not feel quite right. She knelt gently beside the path and examined the gravel. If a man fell unexpectedly, especially onto a surface like this, the objects he carried would rarely remain neatly arranged. A pocket watch might slip from his grasp. It might fall onto the ground. It might roll slightly along the gravel, but it would not normally remain clasped so carefully in his hand. Miss Marple stood slowly and brushed a small piece of gravel from her glove. "That is rather curious," she murmured softly to herself. At that moment, she heard the faint creak of a gate. Thomas Bell, the gardener, stepped into the garden carrying a watering can. "Oh, good afternoon, Miss Marple," he said politely. "Good afternoon, Thomas." Miss Marple smiled warmly. "I hope you don't mind my wandering through the garden. Your roses are looking quite lovely." Thomas's face brightened slightly. "Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Wainwright always liked them neat." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Yes, I remember." She glanced once more toward the gravel path. "You were the one who found him, I believe." Thomas shifted his weight slightly. "Yes, ma'am." Miss Marple spoke softly. "Exactly here?" He nodded. "Right by that rose bush?" Miss Marple followed his gesture. "And the watch was in his hand?" "Yes, ma'am." Thomas frowned slightly. "Struck me as odd. To tell the truth—" "Oh? Well," he said slowly, "if a man falls like that, things usually scatter a bit." Miss Marple smiled kindly. Yes, that would seem quite natural. Thomas watered the nearby plants while Miss Marple stood quietly, observing the garden. After a moment, she spoke again. Did you notice anything else unusual that afternoon? Thomas scratched his head thoughtfully. Not really, ma'am, he paused. Though I did hear voices earlier. Miss Marple looked up. Voices? Yes. Someone talking with Mr. Wainwright out here. Do you recall who it was? Thomas shook his head. Couldn't see from where I was standing. Miss Marple nodded slowly. I see. She thanked him kindly and walked back toward the gate. The quiet lane outside seemed unusually peaceful after the thoughtful silence of the garden. Miss Marple began walking toward the village square. Her thoughts had grown considerably clearer now. The watch had not fallen. It had been placed, and if someone had placed it there, they must have wanted it to tell a particular story. A watch stopped at 4 suggested something very convenient. It suggested the exact moment when Gerald Wainwright had fallen. Miss Marple turned the idea gently in her mind as she continued walking. Because if the watch had been placed there deliberately, then it had been placed by someone who wished the world to believe that the death occurred precisely at 4 o'clock. The question was why? She was still considering this when she reached the small street where the village shops stood. A familiar sign hung above one narrow doorway. Calder and Sons Watch Repair. Miss Marple paused briefly. There was one small matter she wished to confirm. The shop bell rang softly as she stepped inside. Mr. Calder looked up from his workbench. Ah, Miss Marple. Good afternoon, Mr. Calder. She smiled pleasantly. I hope you will forgive another small question. Not at all. Miss Marple stepped closer to the counter. You mentioned earlier that Mr. Wainwright's watch was running perfectly when it left your shop. That's correct. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. I wondered about something purely out of curiosity. Mr. Calder adjusted his spectacles. Yes? If a watch were struck sharply against a hard surface, would it stop? Mr. Calder considered the question carefully. It might. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And if the glass were cracked at the same moment? That could certainly jam the hands, he said. Miss Marple smiled. How interesting. Mr. Calder leaned forward slightly. Why do you ask? Miss Marple gave a small, gentle shrug. Oh, just a thought that crossed my mind. Mr. Calder hesitated before speaking again. Someone asked me something similar earlier this week. Miss Marple looked up. Did they? Yes. Mr. Calder's voice lowered slightly. They asked whether a watch could be made to stop at a specific time if the glass were struck. Miss Marple remained perfectly still. And what did you tell them? I said such things were not proper work for a watchmaker. Miss Marple nodded slowly. A very sensible answer. She waited a moment before asking quietly. Do you happen to remember who asked the question? Mr. Calder hesitated. Yes, he said at last. I remember very clearly. Miss Marple thanked him warmly and stepped back outside. The village square lay peacefully beneath the fading afternoon light. Children were playing near the fountain. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Everything looked entirely ordinary. Yet Miss Marple's thoughts had suddenly become very certain, because someone in St. Aldwyn had already been thinking about a watch that could stop at a particular time. Someone had asked about it before Gerald Wainwright was found in the garden. Miss Marple began walking slowly back toward the quiet lane leading to Rosebank House. The evening breeze moved softly through the hedges as the church bell rang in the distance. One small detail had changed everything. The watch had not simply stopped. The watch had been prepared. Prepared to tell a very particular lie, and Miss Marple, walking thoughtfully beneath the golden evening sky, realized someone in the village had planned that lie long before Gerald Wainwright ever stepped into his rose garden. Chapter 6. The vicarage dinners in St. Aldwyn were known for their gentle formality. The long wooden table was always laid with quiet care, the silver polished until it reflected the candlelight, and the conversation arranged with the same politeness as the plates. Nothing dramatic ever happened at the vicarage. That was precisely why Miss Marple accepted the invitation with particular interest. Because when people believed themselves to be in calm company, their guard often slipped in the most revealing ways. The evening had settled softly over the village. A pale moon hung above the church tower, and the warm glow from the vicarage windows spilled onto the garden path. Miss Marple arrived just as the first bell sounded from the church clock. Mrs. Colby, the vicar's wife, welcomed her with a warm smile. "My dear Miss Marple, how lovely to see you." "Thank you for inviting me," Miss Marple replied gently. The drawing room had already begun filling with guests. The gathering was small, but familiar. In a village like St. Aldwyn, the same handful of faces appeared in many rooms, always carrying small pieces of the same quiet stories. Mrs. Harcourt sat comfortably near the fireplace, speaking in a low tone with Dr. Lambert. Clara Wainwright stood near the window, her posture careful and polite, though her eyes carried a hint of strain that had not quite faded since her uncle's passing. Near the mantelpiece stood Mr. Lionel Pierce, his expression composed yet distant. Miss Marple greeted each of them warmly. "Such a pleasant evening," she said kindly as she settled into her chair. Mrs. Harcourt nodded eagerly. "Yes, the weather has been remarkably kind this week." Small talk moved easily at first. The soup was served, followed by a quiet discussion about the church garden and the new schoolmaster who had arrived from the next county. Yet beneath the polite conversation, Miss Marple sensed a delicate tension lingering in the room. The recent events at Rosebank House had not entirely faded from the minds of the guests. It was Mrs. Harcourt, as usual, who gently guided the discussion back toward the subject. "I passed Rosebank House this afternoon," she said, lifting her teacup. "The roses are blooming beautifully." Clara gave a faint smile. "My uncle always took great pride in them." Dr. Lambert nodded thoughtfully. He often spoke about that garden during his visits. Mr. Pierce cleared his throat quietly. "Yes, he was very fond of it." Miss Marple watched him carefully as he spoke. There was something slightly stiff in the way he held his teacup, as though his hands had not quite found a comfortable position. Mrs. Colby poured fresh tea for everyone. "The whole village has been terribly saddened by his passing," she said kindly. "Yes," Mrs. Harcourt agreed. "Such a sudden thing." The room grew momentarily quiet. Miss Marple spoke softly into that silence. "I have been thinking about that afternoon," she said gently. Several eyes turned toward her. Clara shifted slightly in her chair. "It must have been around 4 o'clock," Mrs. Harcourt added carefully. Clara nodded quickly. "Yes, my uncle was indoors around that time." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Was he?" The question was asked so mildly that no one could possibly consider it an accusation. Yet the air in the room seemed to tighten slightly. Clara looked uncertain. "Well, I assumed he was reading letters." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Of course." Dr. Lambert leaned back in his chair. "I suppose the exact time hardly matters now." Miss Marple nodded politely. "That is quite true." She paused briefly before adding in a thoughtful tone, "Though time can sometimes reveal curious things." Mrs. Harcourt looked interested. "How do you mean?" Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. "Well," she said softly, "several people seem to remember that afternoon differently." Mr. Pierce shifted again beside the mantelpiece. Miss Marple continued gently. "For instance, Mrs. Harcourt mentioned seeing Mr. Wainwright walking near the church path shortly before 4. Mrs. Harcourt nodded eagerly. "Yes, I remember it quite clearly." Miss Marple turned her calm gaze toward Mr. Pierce. "And Mr. Pierce mentioned he left Rosebank House earlier in the afternoon." Mr. Pierce straightened slightly. "Yes, around 3:30. Clara looked up. "I thought you said 3. Mr. Pierce blinked. "Well, around that time." Miss Marple watched the exchange with quiet interest. Such small contradictions often appeared harmless at first, yet they had a curious way of growing larger the longer they remained unexplained. Mrs. Colby attempted to lighten the atmosphere. "It is easy to lose track of time on a pleasant afternoon," she said cheerfully. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. She lifted her eyes thoughtfully, especially when watches are involved. Mr. Pierce's hand tightened slightly around his teacup. Clara lowered her gaze toward the table. Miss Marple continued in the same calm voice. That watch has been mentioned quite frequently these past few days. Dr. Lambert nodded. Stopped at 4, they say. Yes, Miss Marple said. She let the silence linger a moment before adding quietly, though watches can sometimes be misleading. Mrs. Harcourt looked puzzled. Misleading? Miss Marple smiled softly, only occasionally. She glanced around the table, noticing once again the subtle reactions. Mr. Pierce avoided looking directly at her. Clara seemed suddenly very interested in the pattern of the tablecloth. Dr. Lambert leaned forward slightly. You believe the watch may not be accurate? Miss Marple gave a gentle shrug. Oh, watches are very reliable things. Her eyes moved slowly around the room. But people are sometimes less so. No one spoke for several seconds. The quiet ticking of the clock on the wall seemed unusually loud. Mrs. Harcourt cleared her throat. There was also some talk about business matters, she said cautiously. Clara looked up again. My uncle's business? Yes, Mrs. Harcourt replied. I heard there had been some financial concerns. Mr. Pierce's voice came quickly. That is not entirely accurate. Miss Marple turned toward him. Oh? He hesitated before speaking again. Merely routine adjustments in the accounts. Miss Marple nodded politely. Of course. Dr. Lambert spoke thoughtfully. Still, Mr. Wainwright did mention something troubling during our last conversation. Clara looked surprised. He did? Yes. Dr. Lambert frowned slightly as he tried to recall the exact words. He said he had recently discovered something in the company accounts that required correction. Miss Marple's eyes brightened faintly. That is interesting. Clara looked toward Mr. Pierce. Did you know about that? Mr. Pierce's expression remained carefully neutral. Mr. Wainwright had many concerns. Miss Marple leaned back comfortably in her chair, and yet she said softly, the watch remains the most curious detail. Mr. Pierce's voice sounded tight. How so? Miss Marple smiled kindly. Because the watch appears to be telling a story. Mrs. Harcourt leaned forward eagerly. A story? Yes. Miss Marple folded her hands gently in her lap. A story that suggests Mr. Wainwright fell at exactly 4 o'clock. She paused. But several other details suggest something quite different. The candlelight flickered softly across the table. Mr. Pierce's face had grown noticeably pale. Clara's fingers rested motionless beside her plate. Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair. My goodness, she said gently. I fear I may have spoken too seriously for such a pleasant evening. Mrs. Colby stood as well. Not at all, my dear. Miss Marple smiled kindly at everyone in the room. Still, one must not trouble guests with too many questions. She reached for her gloves. As she stepped toward the door, she glanced briefly back toward the table. Several people were watching her now with expressions that were no longer quite as relaxed as before. Miss Marple paused beside the doorway, because one small thought had now settled very firmly in her mind. The watch had been placed to create a particular moment. 4 o'clock, a moment that conveniently placed several people far away from the garden, and Miss Marple, stepping quietly out into the cool night air, began to wonder whether the watch had been meant not only to hide a crime, but perhaps to protect someone else entirely. Chapter 7. The morning arrived in St. Aldwyn with a soft gray sky and the quiet hum of ordinary village life. The baker opened his shop before sunrise, the milk cart rolled slowly along the narrow lane, and the church bell marked the early hour with gentle certainty. Yet beneath that calm routine, a small ripple of anticipation had begun to move through the village. Word had spread that the watchmaker from Broadford was coming to Rosebank House. Miss Marple had learned this the evening before, during a brief conversation with Mrs. Harcourt, who possessed an uncanny ability to hear news before it was formally announced. They say Mr. Calder is bringing something important, Mrs. Harcourt had whispered excitedly. Miss Marple had merely smiled. Yes, she had said softly. I imagine he is. Now, as the village clock chimed 10, Miss Marple walked slowly toward Rosebank House. The gravel road leading there was still damp from the early morning dew, and the hedges glistened faintly in the pale light. A few birds moved lazily through the branches overhead. Everything looked perfectly ordinary. Yet Miss Marple felt that quiet sense of completion that often arrived just before the final piece of a puzzle slipped into place. The front gate of Rosebank House stood slightly open. Inside the garden, Thomas Bell was trimming the roses, his shears clicking rhythmically as he worked. When he noticed Miss Marple approaching, he tipped his cap politely. Good morning, Miss Marple. Good morning, Thomas. Miss Marple paused briefly to admire the roses. They are looking particularly fine today. Thomas smiled faintly. Mr. Wainwright always liked them neat. Miss Marple nodded gently before continuing toward the house. Inside, the drawing room had been prepared for visitors. Clara Wainwright stood near the window, her expression composed but restless. Mr. Lionel Pierce sat in a chair near the fireplace, his posture stiff and unusually quiet. Miss Marple greeted them both warmly. I hope I am not arriving too early. Clara shook her head. Not at all. We are expecting Mr. Calder any moment. Mr. Pierce nodded politely. Though he said nothing, the silence in the room felt heavier than usual, as if each person present sensed that something important was about to be said. A moment later, the sound of footsteps approached the door. Thomas appeared in the doorway. The watchmaker has arrived. Mr. Calder stepped inside carrying a small leather case. He removed his hat respectfully. Good morning. Miss Marple greeted him with a gentle smile. Thank you for coming, Mr. Calder. He placed the case on the small table near the center of the room. I believe I may be able to clarify a few things about Mr. Wainwright's watch. Clara folded her hands nervously. Yes, we would appreciate that. Mr. Calder opened the leather case and carefully removed the gold pocket watch. Even now, the cracked glass reflected the morning light in a thin, jagged line. He placed the watch on the table. I examined it again this morning, he said calmly. Miss Marple stepped slightly closer, her eyes resting thoughtfully on the small object. Mr. Calder continued. The damage to the glass was not caused by an ordinary fall. Clara looked confused. What do you mean? Mr. Calder adjusted his spectacles. The crack begins at a precise angle and travels across the glass in a straight line. That happens when the watch is struck deliberately against a firm edge. The room grew very quiet. Mr. Pierce shifted slightly in his chair. Miss Marple spoke gently. In other words, the watch did not break when Mr. Wainwright fell. Mr. Calder nodded. No. Clara stared at the watch. But the hands stopped at 4. Yes, Mr. Calder said. That was the intention. Miss Marple glanced toward the others in the room. The intention? Mr. Calder lifted the watch carefully and turned it so the cracked glass faced the light. When the glass cracked, the mechanism jammed the hands exactly where they were at that moment. Miss Marple's voice remained soft. So if someone struck the watch at 4 o'clock, the watch would stop at 4. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Quite convenient. Clara looked from one person to another. You mean someone did this deliberately? Miss Marple answered quietly. Yes. The silence deepened. Mr. Pierce spoke suddenly. That seems rather unlikely. Miss Marple turned toward him with her gentle smile. Does it? He cleared his throat. Surely no one would go to such trouble. Miss Marple walked slowly across the room. Her voice remained calm, almost conversational. Oh, I believe someone did. She paused beside the window. Because the watch was meant to create a very particular impression. Clara's voice trembled slightly. What impression? Miss Marple folded her hands together. That Mr. Wainwright died precisely at 4 o'clock. Mr. Calder nodded quietly. And if people believed that, Miss Marple continued the thought. Then anyone seen elsewhere at 4 would appear entirely innocent. The room seemed to grow colder. Mr. Pierce's gaze remained fixed on the carpet. Miss Marple turned toward the small group gathered around the table. But there is a difficulty with that story. Clara looked up slowly. A difficulty? Yes. Miss Marple's voice was almost kind. Because several small details suggest that Mr. Wainwright's death occurred earlier than 4. Mr. Pierce looked up sharply. Miss Marple continued calmly. Mrs. Harcourt saw Mr. Wainwright walking along the church path shortly before 4. Clara nodded, faintly. Yes, Miss Marple lifted the watch from the table, and the watchmaker confirmed that the watch had been working perfectly before that afternoon. Mr. Calder added quietly. Until someone struck it, Miss Marple placed the watch back on the table. That means the watch was damaged after Mr. Wainwright was already lying in the garden. Clara covered her mouth softly. Miss Marple's eyes moved slowly around the room, which leaves only one question. Mr. Pierce remained very still. Miss Marple's voice softened. Who was with Mr. Wainwright earlier that afternoon? The answer hung silently in the air. Miss Marple spoke again. We know Mr. Pierce visited the house that day. Mr. Pierce rose suddenly. I already explained that. Yes, Miss Marple said gently. You explained that you left around 3. Mr. Pierce's face had grown pale. Miss Marple continued. And we also know Mr. Wainwright had discovered irregularities in the company accounts. Clara turned toward him in shock. Is that true? Mr. Pierce did not answer. Miss Marple's voice remained steady. Mr. Wainwright had written a letter to his solicitor. He intended to correct a serious mistake the following morning. Mr. Pierce's hands trembled slightly. Miss Marple stepped closer to the table. It seems very likely that he confronted the person responsible for that mistake. No one spoke. The silence was now thick with realization. Miss Marple's eyes rested quietly on Mr. Pierce, and that conversation took place in the rose garden shortly after 3 o'clock. Mr. Pierce looked up slowly. For a moment his expression seemed ready to collapse beneath the weight of what had just been said. Miss Marple's voice softened even further, which means that when the watch was struck at 4, Mr. Wainwright had already been lying there for nearly an hour. Clara sank slowly into her chair. The room felt very still. Mr. Pierce's shoulders sagged slightly. Miss Marple watched him calmly, because the lie of the watch had now unraveled, and the truth was standing quietly in the room, waiting to be spoken aloud. Chapter 8. The room at Rosebank House had grown unusually quiet. Outside the tall windows, the morning light rested peacefully across the rose garden, and the faint sound of a breeze moving through the hedges drifted into the drawing room. It was the kind of calm morning that might have belonged to any ordinary day in St. Aldwyn. Yet inside the room, no one felt the comfort of that calm. Miss Marple stood beside the small table where the cracked watch still rested. Clara Wainwright remained seated, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her face pale with a mixture of confusion and dawning understanding. Mr. Calder, the watchmaker, stood quietly near the mantelpiece, while Dr. Lambert and Mrs. Harcourt had gathered near the doorway, both watching the scene with careful attention. Mr. Lionel Pierce stood near the window. For several moments he had not spoken at all. Miss Marple did not hurry the silence. She had always believed that silence had a way of encouraging the truth to appear more naturally than pressure ever could. At last she spoke again, her voice calm and gentle. Mr. Wainwright was a careful man, she said. He kept his accounts in good order, and he rarely allowed mistakes to remain uncorrected for long. Clara looked toward her slowly. Yes, that was certainly true. Miss Marple nodded. And yet recently he discovered something very troubling within the company accounts. No one in the room moved. Miss Marple continued quietly. A mistake. He called it in the letter to his solicitor. But I suspect it was rather more serious than a simple error. Her eyes turned toward Mr. Pierce. A considerable amount of money had disappeared. Mr. Pierce's shoulders tightened slightly. Clara's voice trembled. Lionel, is that true? He did not answer immediately. Miss Marple walked slowly across the room. Financial difficulties can be very uncomfortable matters, she said gently, particularly when a man has built his reputation upon trust. Mr. Pierce spoke at last, though his voice sounded tired. You know nothing about my circumstances. Miss Marple smiled kindly. Oh, I know very little indeed, she said softly, but I do know that unpaid bills often reveal more than their owners realize. Mr. Pierce looked up sharply. Miss Marple continued. You visited Mr. Wainwright on the afternoon of his death. You expected another conversation about the accounts. His eyes lowered again. Miss Marple's tone remained patient. But Mr. Wainwright had already examined the records. He had discovered exactly how much money had been taken. Clara stared at Mr. Kate, Pierce in disbelief. You told me the business was doing well. Mr. Pierce closed his eyes briefly. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. I imagine the conversation in the garden became rather unpleasant. Thomas Bell's earlier remark echoed faintly in her mind. Voices in the garden. Sharp voices. Mr. Pierce's hands were trembling slightly now. Miss Marple continued, still speaking with the gentle tone of someone describing something long past. Mr. Wainwright confronted you near the rosebeds. He informed you that he intended to visit his solicitor the following morning. The room remained silent. He intended to correct the accounts and remove you from the business. Mr. Pierce finally spoke again. He would have ruined me. His voice sounded hollow. Miss Marple nodded softly. Yes. That must have seemed very frightening. She paused a moment. But fear often leads people to make very unfortunate decisions. Mr. Pierce turned slowly toward the window, staring out at the garden. Miss Marple continued. The argument grew heated. Mr. Wainwright was a strong man, but he was not expecting violence. Clara's breath caught quietly. Miss Marple's voice remained steady. During the struggle, he fell backward against the stone bench. Her eyes drifted toward the garden outside. The impact was enough to end his life. Mr. Pierce covered his face briefly with his hand. The silence in the room deepened again. Miss Marple spoke gently. At first, you must have been quite shocked. Mr. Pierce did not move, but after a moment you realized something else. Miss Marple turned slightly toward the table. The watch. Mr. Calder glanced down at the cracked glass. Miss Marple continued. You had already asked the watchmaker an unusual question earlier that week. Mr. Pierce's voice came quietly. I was only curious. Miss Marple nodded. Curiosity can be a dangerous thing. She lifted the watch carefully from the table. You knew that if the glass were struck sharply, the hands would stop at that moment. Mr. Pierce said nothing. Miss Marple continued. So you waited. Clara looked up slowly. Waited? Miss Marple nodded. Yes. You waited until the church clock struck 4. She placed the watch gently back on the table. Then you cracked the glass and placed the watch in Mr. Wainwright's hand. Mr. Pierce's shoulders sagged. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. The watch now told a very convenient story. Anyone who had seen you leave earlier in the afternoon would believe Mr. Wainwright was still alive long after you had gone. Mrs. Harcourt whispered softly. The watch lied. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Yes. She looked toward Mr. Pierce again. But watches are only machines. They cannot control the rest of the story. Mr. Pierce lowered himself slowly into the chair beside the window. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he spoke quietly. I never meant to harm him. Clara closed her eyes. Miss Marple nodded gently. I believe you. He stared at the floor. I only wanted him to listen, to understand. Miss Marple spoke softly. But he would not. Mr. Pierce shook his head. No. The room remained still as the truth settled fully into place. Dr. Lambert stepped quietly toward the door to send for the authorities. No one stopped him. Miss Marple walked slowly toward the window and looked out at the garden. The roses were glowing softly in the late morning sunlight, their petals moving gently in the breeze. It was difficult to believe that such a peaceful place had been the setting for such a desperate moment. Behind her, Mr. Pierce spoke again in a low voice. "I thought the watch would protect me." Miss Marple turned slightly. "Yes," she said kindly, "but watches can only measure time. They cannot change what people remember." Clara rose slowly from her chair, her expression filled with quiet sadness rather than anger. The room remained silent as the distant sound of approaching footsteps could be heard outside the house. Miss Marple picked up her gloves from the table. Her work here was finished. A short while later, she stepped out into the garden and began walking slowly along the gravel path. The same path where Gerald Wainwright had taken his final walk only days before. The roses stood tall on either side, their soft fragrance drifting gently through the warm air. Miss Marple paused beside the stone bench and looked thoughtfully toward the place where the body had been found. In villages like St. Aldwyn, people often believed that mysteries belonged only in books. They imagined their quiet lanes and peaceful gardens were safe from darker things. Yet Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that human nature rarely changed from place to place. Even the most peaceful village could hide moments of fear, pride, and desperate decisions. She continued slowly toward the garden gate. The village beyond looked as calm as ever. Children's voices drifted faintly from the schoolyard, and the distant sound of the church bell marked the passing hour. Miss Marple paused once more and allowed her eyes to rest on the garden behind her. A gold watch had tried to tell a simple story, but the truth had been far more complicated. Miss Marple smiled gently to herself as she stepped onto the quiet lane, because even the most reliable watch could sometimes lie. But human nature, when observed with patience, almost never did. The afternoon settled gently over St. Aldwyn as Miss Marple walked along the quiet village lane. The sun had moved lower in the sky, casting long golden shadows across the hedges and stone walls. The air carried that calm stillness that villages often held after a moment of great disturbance, as though the place itself was slowly returning to its natural rhythm. Behind her, Rosebank House stood silent again. The small gathering inside had already begun to disperse. Dr. Lambert had spoken quietly with the authorities, and Mr. Pierce had been taken away without protest. He had walked out of the house with the tired expression of a man who knew there was nothing left to defend. Clara Wainwright had remained standing by the window, watching the garden with distant eyes. Miss Marple had paused briefly before leaving. Clara had spoken softly, her voice still carrying the weight of everything she had just learned. "I keep thinking about my uncle walking in the garden that afternoon," she had said. "He loved those roses. It seems impossible that something so terrible could happen in such a peaceful place." Miss Marple had given her a kind and understanding look. "Peaceful places are still part of the same world as everywhere else," she had replied gently, "and people carry their worries with them wherever they go." Now, as Miss Marple walked past the low stone wall near the churchyard, she reflected quietly on the strange little trail of clues that had led to the truth. It had begun with a watch. Such an ordinary object. Watches were designed to do only one thing. They measured time faithfully, hour after hour, day after day. People trusted them completely because they seemed so certain. And yet in this case, the watch had told a lie. Or rather, it had been made to tell one. Miss Marple smiled faintly as she thought about it. It was a clever idea in its way. A cracked piece of glass, a moment carefully chosen, and a watch that stopped at exactly 4 o'clock. Anyone looking at that small, golden face would naturally assume it marked the moment when Gerald Wainwright had fallen in the garden. But human behavior rarely fits so neatly into a single moment. There had been the letter to the solicitor, written with quiet determination. There had been the raised voices in the garden, overheard by the maid. There had been the nervous tone in Mr. Pierce's voice whenever the watch was mentioned. And above all, there had been the simple fact that objects placed too carefully often reveal the hand that arranged them. Miss Marple turned onto the path beside the church. The bells had begun ringing softly for the late afternoon hour. Their familiar sound drifted across the rooftops and through the quiet village streets. Life in St. Aldwyn would continue as it always had. The baker would open his shop in the morning. Mrs. Harcourt would share the latest village news over tea. Children would run past the church gate on their way to school. And the rose garden at Rosebank House would bloom again next spring. Miss Marple paused near the churchyard gate and looked back toward the distant garden wall. People often believed that mysteries were extraordinary things, she thought. They imagined complicated plots and dramatic secrets. But more often the truth was much simpler. Fear, money, pride. Those were the quiet forces that moved human hearts in every village and every city alike. Miss Marple adjusted her gloves gently and continued walking down the lane. The sky above St. Aldwyn had turned a soft shade of evening gold, and the peaceful rhythm of the village had already begun to settle back into place. And somewhere in a small evidence box, a cracked gold watch rested silently, its hands forever stopped at 4 o'clock, marking the moment it had tried to deceive the world.